Okay, it's 10 a.m. according to my clock. My name is Donna Reiner, and I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar about the role of the Archaeology Advisory Committee in Cultural Resource Management. I am on the board of the Arizona Preservation Foundation, one of the co-sponsors of this. These webinars, free webinars, matter of fact, started during the time of COVID when we had to cancel our conference. And since then, we have tried to offer these free programs periodically throughout the year on a variety of subjects. They are recorded. So if you want to go back, we have a Arizona Preservation Foundation has a YouTube channel, and you can go back and look at many of the other ones that we've had before. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We ask that you make sure that you stay muted. And if you have questions, please use the chat and ask the questions there, and that we will get at the end of Tom's presentation. We will provide those questions to him, and hopefully he can answer them. My co-host as far as this program is Margaret Hangen, who is on the committee that plans these webinars. So other thing, if you do have ideas of a subject that you would like, please put those in our chat because we're always looking for new ideas. So Margaret will introduce our speaker, Tom. Take it away, Margaret.
Thank you. Good morning. I have the pleasure of serving with Tom Jones on the Historic Archaeology Advisory Committee. So it's with great pleasure that I get to tell you a little bit about him. Mr. Jones has more than 30 years of experience in archaeology investigations, historical artifact analysis, historical research, and National Register nominations, documentation for Habs Hair, and historical buildings inventories. For those who are not familiar with Habs Hair, I'm sure he'll talk about that. Mr. Jones meets the professional requirement of historian under the Secretary of the Interior standards. He has contributed to all forms of archaeological reports and has authored and presented papers for professional and avocational audiences. He sits on the Historic Archaeology Advisory Committee, HAC, and was a longtime member of the Phoenix Historical Preservation Commission and Governor's Archaeology Advisory Commission. As a member of HAC, Mr. Jones assisted the Arizona SHPO in the development of inventory forms for historical in-use structures, as well as a field guide for recording structures and preparing the forms. He is intimately familiar with the documentation and evaluation of historical in-use structures. With that, I present Mr. Tom Jones. Take it away, Tom.
Thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you, Donna. Good morning to all of you. I want to thank you for attending this morning and taking time to suffer through this with all of us. As Margaret said, I am Thomas Jones. I'm a senior archaeologist and historical archaeologist with Logan Simpson, based out of Tempe. I started working in this industry in 1992, and good Lord willing, I'll probably be working for another 10 to 15 years. When I was asked to prepare this webinar, I was honestly not quite sure how to organize it. And I decided to go overboard. And now I'm seeing that's quite a few of the guests or attendees today are fellow archaeologists. So if I say anything wrong, be sure to point that out. And as Donna already said as well, if you have any questions throughout this talk, you're welcome just to put them into the comments, and someone will yell them out so that I can hopefully answer these questions, or maybe we can have some of the other attendees as well. Before we begin, let me give you an outline of how this will go today. I thought I'd start the talk today with just a brief summary of Arizona's cultural heritage, extending back thousands of years. Archaeologists generally use these broad cultural periods, all of which are defined by population growth and demographic change, interaction, trade, and regional environmental change. I'll follow this short summary with a discussion of the National Historic Preservation Act and how sections written into this act in 1966 and even after influenced the growth of cultural resource management, which is the industry that we work in. As I said before, I started in 1992, so throughout this, I'll try to interweave my experience and the projects I worked on to highlight just how the industry has grown over the last 50 years and why we are still an essential component today for federal, state, and locally funded construction projects across the state. I'll finally finish this webinar with the whole point of this discussion today, which is historical archaeology and why it has become increasingly important in our industry in the year 2025. And I'll then briefly explain why our committee, the Historical Archaeology Advisory Committee, was established to address the lack of attention to these types of resources. Before we even begin, I'm just going to give you a few of the acronyms that I'm going to use in this discussion. Every industry, I'm sure all the ones that you work in, have their own list of acronyms that you guys recite, by nature at this point. And these are the ones that we use quite often. CRM is cultural resource management. For all intents and purposes, that's the name of our industry, which comprises not just archaeologists, but also historians and architectural historians, geomorphologists, paleobotanists, and ethnographers, among a few. Many of us work for private companies who are contracted by government agencies, by land managing agencies, engineers and contractors, and private companies to identify cultural resources that could be impacted by proposed development or construction projects. We prefer to conduct our activities early in the process of these construction projects so that our clients have the opportunity to revise their construction plans in order to avoid sensitive and eligible resources. In cases where avoidance is not possible, it's our job to recommend appropriate mitigation measures before any construction work can begin. Mitigation might be data recovery or excavation of a site, or it might be limited to archaeological monitoring during the construction to ensure that no important resources are in danger of obliteration. As I hinted above, the earlier this process occurs, the better it is for everyone. Just as an example, Logan Simpson and several others completed cultural resource clearance. Actually, it wasn't Logan Simpson. This was my old company, ACS. We completed cultural resource clearance for the Valley Metro Light Rail. Our part of this project started in 2002 and we finished by 2009. For those of you who are familiar with the light rail, the line was essentially completed in 2008. So we were doing plenty of work before construction had even begun. Over the last 20 years, light rail and streetcar extensions in Mesa, Tempe, North Phoenix, and South Phoenix have all required additional cultural resource clearance before they could be constructed. Many of us also use the term CRM to refer to one another's companies whom they work for. Logan Simpson is the company I currently work for, and that's one of the CRM companies. I'll be using that often as well throughout this discussion. Margaret is in the business of CRM, and there are several others on today who are also in the business of CRM, but they are not necessarily working for a CRM company. Margaret works for a federal land, or she worked for a federal land managing agency before she had the privilege of retiring. She worked for the U.S. Forest Service. And her job was to contract with private CRM companies like Logan Simpson to ensure that cultural resources on forest lands were adequately protected by developments or recreational tourism. A good friend of mine, Dan Garcia, he is also attending today. He works with the Salt River Project, and he does much the same thing. He's part of the industry, but he contracts out with CRM companies like myself. And then there's Lauren Jelinek, who is, oh, I see Jessica. They're both reclamation archaeologists doing much the same thing with their historical resources and cultural resources. Many of our preservation partners, like city and county historic preservation offices that also work within the CRM industry, though largely limited to their municipal boundaries. While not employed or specifically contracted to work on projects, advocacy groups like the Arizona Preservation Foundation do their part to influence local, state, and federal politicians and agencies to ensure that we still can do our job. Then there's the NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act. Although CRM works under multiple federal and state laws, it was the NHPA which was signed into law in 1966 and amended multiple times since that really influenced the growth of CRM across the country. The act generally stipulates that any federal project must first account for impacts on historic properties from proposed construction activities. This act applies to any project that occurs on federal land or within the right-of-way of federally owned land. And it's applied to any project that is either run or sponsored by a federal agency or is using federal money or loans. This last one is very important as it impacts private developers who may be using a HUD loan, for instance, to construct an apartment complex. SHPO is the State Historic Preservation Office. A State Historic Preservation Office, a SHPO, has been established in every state across the country. This office was created by the NHPA to help coordinate and review projects that must comply with the NHPA. The SHPO works to ensure cultural resources are preserved and or mitigated appropriately for federal and state projects. While CRM companies are contracted to complete the investigations and make recommendations on additional work for projects, the SHPO and other agencies will ensure that our recommendations for further work are adequate. The SHPO periodically develops procedures and directives for CRM companies to follow as well. The SHPO is also responsible for encouraging counties and cities to likewise develop historic preservation programs to protect their cultural resources and promote historic preservation across the state through public education, publications, and talks across all spectrums. ASM, the Arizona State Museum. This museum is located on the University of Arizona campus in Tucson, founded in 1893. This museum is the main repository for all things archaeological, including artifacts, ethnographic collections, research collections, archival documents and maps, you name it. The museum also holds the records of archaeological projects and documented sites from the last century. It is through the ASM that we, CRM companies, request permits to access and conduct archaeological surveys on state and municipal lands. And when the project has been completed and all parties have concurred with the reports and agree with it, we submit the project information and reports to ASM as well for storage. HAC. I know this is an odd sounding acronym, but I'm honored to be affiliated with this group. The Historical Archaeology Advisory Committee was initially formed in the late 1990s, and except for a brief few years in the late 2000s, it has worked with the SHPO since and other agencies to promote the preservation of historical resources and to ensure they are adequately evaluated for any projects, whether government or private. We'll talk more about HAC and the role that we play as the talk progresses. Let's start the discussion today with a brief synopsis of Arizona's rich cultural history. As the abstract for this webinar stated, this history extends thousands of years into the past when much of North America was under the latest and greatest ice age. Thanks in large part to the NRHP, archaeologists have learned a great deal more about our cultural history in just the last 60 years than we had in the century prior. The earliest known indigenous peoples in Arizona were the Paleo-Indian people. The Paleo-Indians were nomadic hunters who followed the large mammals of the time, like the mammoths. The only indication that we have found of their presence from so long ago are the few kill sites of large megafauna and associated projectile points that were used to bring down these beasts. We use the term projectile points, by the way, only because they could be arrowheads, they could be spearheads, spear points. So um, in case you're wondering what I mean when I say projectile points. The very distinctive projectile points from this period are Clovis points. These were large spear points that were carefully and craftily made for hunting large game. The Paleo-Indian people ranged across the continental US, as well as North and South America, and would have lived in bands of extended families ranging over wide areas, depending on the seasons and availability of game. At least 2 kill sites have been investigated in southern Arizona, each with multiple mammoths and other large mammals recovered in association with these spear points. More often than not, however, archaeologists will find Clovis points on the ground surface while they're doing a pedestrian survey with no fossilized remains of megafauna. Cumulatively, more than 100 individual Clovis points have been identified across the state. If I may be so braggadocious, I found one of these points back in 1994 when doing an archaeological survey near the Ben Avery shooting range. It was just north and east of the range itself. Being fairly new, I thoroughly enjoyed finding as many projectile points as I could on these surveys. And when I picked this one up, I let the field director know, this one looks kind of strange. He was, needless to say, he was very excited when I showed him the point, and I had my brief 5 minutes of fame. I was just a young grunt at the time. In the Archaic period, the climate was changing. Megafauna were largely extinct, and hunting had shifted to smaller game, like deer and rabbits. Of course, the major rivers must have had a plethora of fish as well. There also appears to have been an increased reliance on plants for sustenance. The few archaic sites identified in Arizona have been defined as temporary camps where there is evidence of plant processing like fire and thermal pits, as well as chipstone and tool production. It's worth noting that the earliest rock art sites identified in Arizona originated in the Archaic period. In the early agricultural period, the increased reliance on flora encouraged cultivation of plants at well-watered locations like natural reservoirs, rivers, seasonal streams, and washes. There was a trend toward more permanent habitation, although many such sites would still likely have been occupied seasonally. Certainly by at least 2100 BC, canal systems were in use along the Santa Cruz River in the Tucson vicinity, which of course led to more permanent village sites and occupation. This aerial photography, taken about a decade ago, displays the many small fields and ditches that were identified at this Tucson site by carefully stripping the earth, cleaning it up, and marking it in white. Compare this aerial with this artist's rendering of what it might have looked like, what this type of activity and habitation would have looked like so long ago. If there's one thing Tucson can brag about, it's nearly 4,000 years of irrigation in this region. Maize would have likely have been the primary crop at the time, having originated in Mexico and earlier, much earlier, eventually making its way up. It's worth noting that the canals in this early period have not been found along the Salt and Gila rivers of the Phoenix Basin. While it's possible that seasonal crops like maize had not yet spread this far north, it's just as likely that such evidence lies buried under the alluvial soils along the two rivers, considering that both rivers had much higher discharge rates, annual discharge rates than the Santa Cruz River, and given the cycles of flooding that occurred along the two rivers. This period is very complex, and for this discussion at least, we're going to make it very generalized. Across the state and general region, there was a flourishing of cultural development, population growth, and interaction. The entities, the cultural entities that are labeled on this figure are all defined by the material culture that we've identified over the last century, whether it's from site excavations, artifact analyses, interpretation of rock art, and the documentation of trail networks. Each of these cultures and the regions therein have their own specific chronologies, each of which are further divided into periods and phases. which would take way too much time to summarize for today's discussion. Generally, it's within this period of time that these cultures emerged, peaked, and then declined. Each region had their own distinctive and frankly incredible architecture. Tuzigoot was a Snagwa village located near Clarkdale and Cottonwood. The Great Kiva and Masonry rooms at Chaco Canyon were located near the Four Corners. And of course, Casa Grande in Coolidge, where there was a flourishing village of Hohokam from about 500 AD to 1500, with maybe several thousand individuals or residents living along this extensive site. Many of the village sites we work in, however, will be much smaller and without the elaborate and well-preserved masonry architecture. Rather, these sites will consist of multiple pit houses that were excavated into the ground to regulate the temperature, providing shelter for several family members. We typically excavate all features that we find within these houses, which would include post holes for the wall posts, thermal pits and hearths for warming the residents, and also storage pits for food. It was in this period that agriculture in the Phoenix Basin erupted, using only sticks and poles. And with a keen knowledge of gently sloping terrain, the Hohokam constructed hundreds of miles of canal systems within a matter of centuries. This agricultural growth and the interaction that took place between other regional cultures, as well as Mexico, defines the 1,000-year cultural sequence of the Hohokam in the Phoenix Basin. Today, subsurface remnants of these canals remain, but only when we uncover them in data recovery projects. The prehistoric cultures that I displayed in that previous slide appear to have experienced significant decline by the end of the 15th century, whether due to climatic changes that forced the dispersal of populations or internal and external warfare and conflict that resulted in the destruction and of the large villages. While not well understood presently, what we do know, particularly through the ethnographic studies with contemporary tribal communities, is that these once dense village populations dispersed into small, isolated communities during the protohistoric period, emerging as the tribal groups that we're familiar with today. Descendants of the ancestral Pueblo today are the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma, to name just a few. Hohokam descendants are the Tohono O'odham and Acoma O'odham. In fact, O'odham groups, as shown on this slide, dispersed across all of southern Arizona in this period. By the time the Spanish appeared in Arizona, around 1538, 1540, the Apache and Navajo had likewise made their appearance, having slowly migrated south over many centuries from the Canadian region. The Yavapai, who were close allies of the Apache, may have descended from the Patayan cultures, although this is still not well known. They, like the O'odham and Pueblo peoples, however, are descended from the prehistoric peoples. Although the Spanish did not have a strong presence in Arizona at this time, limited primarily to the southern area, their hostility and the impacts to regional populations due to unintended spread of European disease and plague profoundly impacted these cultures in Arizona. Conflict between the O'odham and the Apache and Yavapai was endemic in this period. While archaeologists have made some progress in identifying protohistoric sites and remains, this period is still not well understood, at least not in an archaeological manner. The two books shown here are examples of scholarship that have shed some light on the period. The historic period covers the last 300 years or so of Arizona's history, which is best divided into the Spanish and Mexican era and the Euro-American era. The Spanish period is marked by Father Kino's work in the region that was known historically as Pimeria Alta. Comprising portions of northern Mexico, southern Arizona, and New Mexico, Kino founded multiple missions, which were protected by presidios at Tubac and Tucson, and several more. The Napoleonic Wars in Europe led to the dissolution of the Spanish imperial empire, and in 1821, Mexico declared its independence. However, constant conflict in Mexico led to unrest across the Northern Territory, which was eventually acquired by the United States with the conclusion of the Mexican-American War in 1848. In the brief period of Mexican rule, the Apache increased their attacks on residents of Tucson and Tubac, and all missions were abandoned. Over several years after 1848, the international border between Mexico and the United States was hammered out. Oops, there's a couple of images of some of the Spanish missions. After 1854, Arizona was an American territory, although it was combined with New Mexico as one large territory, at least temporarily. We use the term Euro-American to define this era because in the first half century and even longer, a sizable number of European migrants moved out to the west and into Arizona to make a life for their families. Thousands of homesteads were patented after the American Civil War, which encouraged the establishment of towns, cities, and branches, and of course the road networks that connected them all. It was in this post-Civil War era that Arizona began to take form and when our 5 C's really influenced its growth. This is the period of Arizona's growth and development that will be the focus of the presentation today. But first, I'm just going to say a few words about the NHPA and how our industry, the CRM industry, has grown over the last 60 years. Archaeologists were exploring prehistoric sites across the territory as early as the 1880s and 1890s. Sponsored by either wealthy benefactors, museums, or universities, their investigations provided the earliest attempts to somewhat systematically explore, record, and map these sites. However, because these expeditions were sponsored by external entities, a sizable collection of sensitive artifacts, sacred items, and human remains were removed in this period to be stored in any number of museums on the East Coast. Today, tribal communities are still trying to repatriate these remains. Through much of the 20th century, archaeology was largely an academic profession, primarily affiliated with the University of Arizona and the ASM. At least these artifacts were stored in Arizona rather than some outside location. Archaeologists also began to take their role as stewards more seriously. The rapid growth of agriculture in the Salt River Valley, for instance, was endangering the integrity of sites and canal systems, many of which were still clearly visible on the ground at this time. Canal maps like this were drawn by archaeologists and engineers in the early decades of the 20th century to record these systems before they disappeared entirely. These maps are still used today by CRM companies to inform us of how these systems developed over time. Many of you may have visited the Sedivaki Museum in East Phoenix. This extensive village site was occupied nearly 1,000 years before the destruction of the platform mound prior to 1500, whereupon its residents dispersed across the valley. Preservation initiatives led to the establishment of a city museum in 1929, and importantly, the appointment of a city archaeologist to not only preserve the ruins at Sedivaki, but also other ruins across the valley. Following the conclusion of World War II, Arizona experienced significant growth as military veterans and their families relocated to the state. In this period, Arizona's highway department was busy widening highways and assisting with the development of the county's grid systems. After 1956, their focus shifted to the construction of the interstate system, and over the next several decades, Interstates 8, 10, 19, and 40 were completed. The vast acreage of cultivated lands that once separated all the major cities in the Salt River Valley were built up as subdivisions and commercial centers, creating a vast metropolitan area that is currently one of the largest in the country. Many communities like Tempe, Mesa, and Tucson began implementing urban renewal projects that threatened entire neighborhoods and commercial blocks. as they were as particularly Mexican barrio communities, as these areas were largely demolished to make room for modern urban infrastructure. The Arizona State Museum, for their part, ASM, established a highway salvage archaeology program in 1957 to conduct emergency excavations when needed and to identify sites within their project rights of way of new freeways and interstates, offering the highway department a chance to reroute their highways to avoid destroying them. After 20 years of work, the program, through special agreements and contracts with the highway department, had surveyed more than 1,500 miles of roadways, documented more than 400 sites, about half of which were excavated. There was great concern, not only in Arizona, but across the country, that this accelerated development would obliterate underlying cultural resources, whether ancient or prehistoric or historical in age. It was against this backdrop of unprecedented growth and urban development that the NHPA was drafted and signed into law in 1966. This sweeping legislation required federal agencies and projects to address impacts to cultural resources before projects could be initiated and completed. The National Park Service was tasked with running this program and establishing the National Register of Historic Places and other oversight programs, including a SHPO office in every state. Now, the term cultural resources is a rather broad term, but the NHPA defined them thusly. Sites, which are defined as locations of human use, occupation, or activity. A very general term that, of course, includes archaeological sites and petroglyphs, but also includes parks, cemeteries, battlefields, and designed landscapes like golf courses, race courses, and campsites. Now, many of these properties, like especially cemeteries, have their own special considerations for documentation, but we don't have to go into that much detail. Buildings are defined as structures for sheltering humans and human activity. Houses, commercial buildings, industrial buildings, as well as outbuildings like barns and sheds, etc. A structure is not considered to be used for shelter for human use. Actually, for shelter, it's for human use, of course. The structures would include railroad tracks, canals and laterals, power lines, roads and highways, and some of the other examples there. Objects are very small items of artistic or aesthetic value, like monuments, markers, signs, survey markers, and of course a district, which is a concentration of resources, any of those listed above, that are intricately associated by either a historical event or a designed landscape or construction. While not called out or defined specifically in the legislation, a historical resource must generally be 50 years of age or more. And this is where we'll talk about this in a little bit. The passage of this act enabled the establishment of the first CRM companies, who emerged in the late 1970s. In less than 2 decades, there were many more in the Valley, in Tucson and Flagstaff. And from the 1980s well into the new millennium, there was plenty of work for these companies. I started at work at Archaeological Consulting Services, ACS, in 1992. This was one of the first to be established, and it survived through at least 2022 before it finally dissipated. But at the time, in the 90s, I was working on surveys for rights-of-ways for the Valley freeways, like the State Route 101, 202, 51, and we were working on large projects for highway and street widening, as well as urban projects, especially the Bank One baseball stadium. CRM companies conduct cultural clearance for construction projects in a number of ways. There are a few instances, for instance, when we conduct a thorough review of previous work done in an area, and if we can confidently say that there will be no chance of finding any cultural resources, we could recommend no further work. Most of our work, however, is done with pedestrian surveys where we look for cultural resources on the ground surface, including artifacts, surface features, and structures. Many times, the sites are only identified by the artifacts. If you look on this photograph here, all of those pin flags are representing artifacts that these archaeologists identified on the ground surface. And when you're done with the flagging, you can map in the extent of those flags. Here's another example. These flags are largely dispersed, and yet that would still qualify as a site. This photograph on the lower right is actually a deflated trash mound that we documented south of Florence. You don't see any artifacts in this photograph, but if you were to walk along this trash mound, you would see thousands of artifacts along this deflated portion of the mound here, and falling out of the berms that were made by recreational vehicles who plowed right through this trash mound in the course of their fun. Other times, archaeological sites are much easier to spot. Now, I'll admit, since I'm a little biased, these are all historical features. Tent platform here. This is a tent platform where somebody would set up their tent in the center there. These are erosion control feature here, and of course, a mine shaft, or at it. There are times when you're on the survey, when you feel like you're in a Robert Frost poem with beautiful scenery, cool breezes, and fantastic features, historical features in particular. But then there are those surveys that are conducted in urban areas that are not so scenic, and in fact, could be downright dangerous as you try to play chicken with the traffic and the vehicles on either side of you. We have to conduct these surveys because cultural resources are located within these project areas and have to be recorded and evaluated before anything could happen. In this particular case, this lateral is a historical lateral that is well over 50 years old. When sites cannot be avoided, we move into data recovery or excavation. A sizable number of excavations occur in urban areas where some kind of new skyscraper, sports stadium, or large complex building will be constructed. Those two upper photographs were both done in Tempe, in fact, right across the street from one another. The Hayden Flour Mill, for those of you who recognize that structure. And this was on Charles Hayden's Hayden House property. These bottom two were conducted in the urban center of Phoenix. There's a young little whippersnapper getting his first taste of privies or outhouses. Besides having a lot of you-know-what in there, there's quite a few good artifacts that we can grab out of these, and I had the time of my life. You see I'm wearing wrist guards here because it was just one project, this very project in 1994, where I got carpal tunnel syndrome because of all the excavation we did on this property for a year and a half. Up to this point, I have not even touched upon the thesis or subject of this presentation, but I thought that a long introduction of what we do, what we are, and why we are would be important before I got into the main course of this presentation. As I've summarized, Arizona, and if we need to include another state, New Mexico, are arguably the top destinations for archaeologists around the country who want to make a career out of their college education. This is the place where they have a chance for a long tenure, especially considering that the Phoenix metropolitan area, even now, is still among the fastest growing areas around the country. For many of these archaeologists looking for a permanent career and a home in the state, it's only about the Paleo-Indian through the prehistoric cultural remains and, to a degree, protohistoric resources, which are few and far between. But there is one chronological period that I summarized earlier that is considered anathema to archaeologists, and that's the historical period, particularly the Euro-American and American period. In their defense, many of these archaeologists have not had any prior training in historical archaeology or even history for that matter. An education for a BA or a Bachelor of Arts in anthropology is focused almost entirely on pre-industrial cultures, and for those poor souls who advance to a postgraduate program like a Master of Arts or a PhD, their education may be even more focused and isolated to specific periods or to specific regions. I'm showing you this slide again because the 50-year threshold compounds this issue even more. When the NHPA was enacted in 1966, the 50-year threshold was 1916, essentially encompassing all territorial sites and buildings and structures like adobe forts and camps, maybe some very old adobe houses in the urban areas, historical trails, and some old ranches in southern and northern Arizona. Consequently, early on at least, there wasn't much consideration by archaeologists about historical resources. By the mid-1990s, when I was still new to the game, the 50-year threshold was no longer 1916, but 1946, which now encompassed not just World War II era sites, but beginning to address the Cold War and post-war resources as well. Today, our threshold is now 1975, and that's a very sad thing to say. Time really flies. We had just moved here, our family, in 1974, so I'm very sad to say I've been here 50 years. So how do we address this fluid threshold as archaeologists? Well, we cope and we seethe by wearing multiple hats as historical archaeologists. As an archaeologist, we have to recognize historical resources in the field. We have to be knowledgeable about how they're going to be recorded and how to document them in a timely and efficient manner. And we have to understand whether documented resources, multiple ones, are related in some way or have no relation whatsoever. As historians, we have to have knowledge of the historical development of the project area in the immediate area. This is especially important before we even begin a project. When we're offered the job by our client, we have to provide a scope and a budget. And the more we know about this area, and the more we know about what we'll expect to find, especially regarding historical resources, the more accurate that scope and that budget can be. We have to have knowledge about the various archival materials and repositories that are going to be visited in order to provide details on the historical resources that we document and that we evaluate. And finally, our other hat, and I created this hat myself, it's the artifact analyst. There is a lot of complexity to an understanding of historical artifacts, whether it's bottles and jars, glass or porcelain insulators, cans, ammunition, toys, clothing, you name it. It's all historical, and most of these were made en masse as in the industrial area from the mid to late 19th century through today. So we have to recognize these resources in the field. We have to be able to document them in a timely manner, and we have to have the resources available to date these accurately when we're writing up our reports. This is a great map of the Superior vicinity. This is a USGS topography map from 1948. As you can see, at that time, it was a very active mining community and mining area. US 60 is shown, extending through here. And this is the 1948 version of UX 60, by the way. The current one that we drive on today is entirely different. And I might also add that this road, this highway on this map was the third generation of that highway. The first one was initially constructed around early teens. They put in another one in the early 20s, still not paved, but much wider. You won't see those roads on this map because they were no longer being used except by maybe local ranchers and all. Also shown on this map are multiple ranches and mines. Plenty of workings going on all over this area. Each one of these is considered a working or a prospect. Transmission lines, a railroad, all of these resources that are shown on this map were considered historical in 1998. And now you can imagine almost 30 years later in 2025, there are many more resources in the same area that were not yet constructed at this time that we still have to consider. If we were to conduct a very large survey in this area, this would be a literal gold mine and nirvana for historical archaeologists, but would be a nightmare for archaeologists who are not familiar with the documentation and the evaluation of these types of resources. So let's take a look at some of the resources we would find, not just in this area, but also across other parts of Arizona. Mining sites, which could be very small or very large. You comprise multiple shafts, multiple adits, mining cairns, trails, even pedestrian trails. Here's just a few examples. I know you've already seen a couple of these photographs already. Linear structures and sites. You notice now that I'm using sites and structures here. We have to differentiate abandoned roads versus roads that are still in use. That's how we record these types of resources today. This road looks like an abandoned road. You can see the vegetation there. Probably not much in use. We would record this as an archaeological site. This one doesn't look like it's much in use. This was actually an old highway segment because that's eroding asphalt here on the ground surface. But there's a tiny little bush there. I would say this is probably still in use at least once in a while. So we'd probably record this as an in-use structure. And the same with this. This is a good example of an early generation highway. We know that this was a highway because they took the time and the effort to go through a hill here in an effort to make a road cut. Roads, by the way, are probably my favorite historical resource, simply because everyone else seems to hate them so much, and I'm always rooting for the little guy. Railroads. Many of the railroads that we drive over or pass through or drive, parallel to every day, many of those are historical in age. Some of them, like this one here, represent the original railroad, the original Southern Pacific that was constructed and completed in 1880. Transmission lines. These two here that are pictured are really nice and old, very distinctive in their design and construction. But we have to be mindful of more recent lines that are still, nonetheless, 50 years or more. These ones were probably constructed in the early teens and 20s, maybe even the 30s as well. Ranches and homestead sites. These are all good examples of a site rather than, something that's in use. If this ranch were still active, if somebody were still living in this house, if water was still running in this, lateral, for instance, we would record these as one large property with multiple structures. But because they're abandoned now, we can record these as an archaeological site. These are quite common across the state. And of course, open dumps, trash scatters, and waste piles. This is another one of my favorites because, again, everyone hates the historical garbage. But I find this kind of documentation to be challenging and quite rewarding when you can get a really good narrow date range on these types of artifacts. These resources, as I said before, are not just limited to the Superior area. I only showed that as a good example because of all that activity that was going on historically. This is occurring across the entire state. I'm showing the 5 C's again because 2 of those, cotton and citrus, were only successful because of adequate irrigation systems across Arizona and across its major rivers. Here are a few good examples. In the early 20th century, the newly formed U.S. Bureau of Reclamation established several projects in Arizona, the first of which was the Salt River Project with Theodore Roosevelt Dam way up here, feeding water, providing water for all the major canals in the Salt River Valley. Now, some of these have changed. Some of these canals are no longer present, but for the large part, and as Dan can attest, and Lauren and Jessica can attest, these canals are still in place, still very much in use, and still very important to the success and the historical success of the Salt River Valley. Here's an early map of the San Carlos Irrigation Project. The dam itself was constructed in eastern Arizona on the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation, but it provided water sustenance to the main canals in the Florence Casa Grande area of central Pinal County, as well as to the Gila River Indian community. This system is also very much still in use and is undergoing significant expansion thanks to a lawsuit won by the Gila River Indian community in the last 20 years. Here in the Yuma area, there are actually 3 federal reclamation projects, including the Yuma project here, the Gila project, which is all of this, and then the little Yuma auxiliary project. So Yuma has been a booming center of agriculture since at least the 1930s. But there's also agriculture across other areas of the state, especially as a result of electrical production and distribution. These are just some of the few of I guess it's not a few, but these are some of the irrigation districts that occur across the state that are not necessarily fed water through these reclamation projects, but rather through the Central Arizona Project, that huge canal that runs through Arizona. So now, if we were to don our other hat, which is as historians, after documenting these resources in the field, we now have to conduct adequate archival research so we can determine just how important they were for this specific area. Can our research determine whether these sites and structures that we recorded are worthy of preservation or merit further study? Or would our research indicate that they were not that important at all? As historians, we have to know where to go to find these reports, where to go for these materials and maps, photographs, and inventories. Now, mind you, not every resource is going to require going to all of these repositories or locations, but these are some of the most common ones that we go to. Primary resources are very important. Maps, especially the cadastral plats, master title plats. Many of our older communities have Sanborn Parish maps that we review if we're doing a survey within those town sites. This gives you an idea of some of what we can find when we're doing our archival research that might highlight or give us more information as to what types of resources we identified. Secondary resources are just as important. These are books about various industries, about, you name it. Over the last 25 years or so, I have collected one heck of a library of these types of resources, these types of books, buying them online, and maybe making copies. That's something I used to do quite a bit. Would go to ASU, I would check out some books, and then we'd scan them on our computer so I can have them at least, or make printouts. This is in the day before scanning was easy. There are quite a few government repositories that house archival collections that would be very useful for archaeologists who are working on their lands, Forest Service, reclamation, even the state agencies as well. Many of these agencies have their materials online. Some of the sites that I visit most often are for the ASLD with their interactive maps. This is the Arizona State Land Department. Sorry, I should I didn't realize they had this many acronyms. I should have discussed those some more as well, I guess. The Arizona Game and Fish also has a great interactive map online. Local and municipal institutions will also house archival collections like the Arizona Historical Society and some local city societies, not to mention public libraries. And then finally, the main universities, ASU, NAU, and U of A. Now, in the last 20 years, especially the last decade, I think would be a fair statement, there have been a number of websites that we are now able to look for, to download, to review, to find all manner of great primary records, secondary records, great information from these websites. The AMP there is the Arizona Memory Project, which is affiliated with the Arizona State Library. TDAR is the Digital Archival Repository or Archaeological Repository, which is affiliated with ASU. These are great. These have great materials that we can review and download for any manner of projects and resources that we have recorded. We just have to be careful about ensuring that we're going to the appropriate websites and not something that's less than credible, like Wikipedia. Wikipedia is interesting. It might have some decent info to at least start your search on, but by and large, you just don't want to rely on Wikipedia for all of your information, nor do you want to cite it in your reports. That would be a big no-no. So once we have found the archival materials, we've reviewed them for the specific project and the historical resources, we have identified, what do we do then? We have to start writing. We have to develop appropriate, what we call contexts and themes in order to explain why our resources are important or are not that important. These are just a few of the contexts that I've prepared over many years. It differs for every region. It depends on where you are. And this is why it's important that a historical archaeologist is aware from the very beginning of a project of where it's located, what type of industries are prominent in that specific area. Are we in the middle of nowhere, which would probably be a public land for ranching? Or are we in a heavily agricultural area like Yuma, in which case our focus would largely be on irrigation? Is it a major transportation route? Are we liable to, hit some major canals as part of the reclamation project or not? The Arizona SHPO has published a number of historic contexts that are not meant to be used solely for developing these contexts, but are meant to be a stepping stone, as it were. These are all very helpful for the specific resources that you might identify on a project like trails or water features, military sites, silver minings, that kind of a thing. The highlighted one down at the bottom is Down on the Dumps, which is a document that Hack published initially in 2005 and more recently with a revised version in 2021. So now we are with the last cat, that is the analyst. in addition to compiling a large library of historical resource or archival materials like books and reports, we also have to collect a sizable library of books and materials related solely to these types of artifacts. Glass and bottles is probably the most common, as are cans, but we have to be familiar with ceramics, buttons, dolls and toys, insulators. It's quite a collection of materials that I've collected over the years as a historical archaeologist. I have two basic libraries. These are just some of the good little pictures of the types of cans you might identify. These are pretty old, pre-1920, for instance. So having just summarized the three hats that we have to wear as historical archaeologists, I thought I would provide this one last slide as a good example of how merging the three can create a good story. If you look at this photograph on this slide, you see an abandoned road, clearly abandoned, it's no longer used. A dirt road with ruts in there, so it's probably some kind of a wagon road. Now, somebody unfamiliar with historical archaeology or, going the distance with historical research would probably just write it off as being not that significant. But by conducting the requisite research as the historian, we were able to determine that this road was actually an important mail route that extended from Picacho to Florence and even to the mines around Superior as early as 1874 through the early 1920s. And so we were able to recommend that this road was indeed eligible, but knowing that this road could not be saved, we had recommended just additional archival research, writing up a nice report about the road, and that served as mitigation so that the work that can be conducted in this area could continue on, which would result in the destruction of the road. But at least we were able to tell the whole story of this road and get that on the record. This is a good example of how historical archaeology works. From the field, when you're documenting these things, into the post-field portion when you're conducting your archival research and writing up the necessary context, etc. This is what we have tried to do as a committee for the last 25, 30 years, is to inform other CRMs and even people at large who aren't necessarily archaeologists and how important it is to wear all of these hats when conducting archaeological investigations in Arizona, especially for historical resources. And in an effort to reach out to these CRMs, we have published several documents, including the Historical Archaeology in Arizona Research Guide, which provides a nice inventory of all the various repositories across the state, what collections they house, and what types of resources you might find if you were to visit them. Luckily today, many of these repositories are either online or can be reached via email, and they can send you stuff via the internet. We are currently working on a revised 7th edition, which will probably take a couple more years. We also published, as I said before, Down in the Dumps, originally in 2005, and we've updated in 2021. This document is actually being used by more and more CRMs, which is a good thing, as a way to document open dumps, trash scatters, and waste pile sites so that we can efficiently and accurately record these. Most of them would not be considered eligible, since most of these dumps and scatters are located well outside any kind of rural or outside of any settled communities. People would just take this out to the desert and dump their trash. That was a very common practice even through the early 70s. However, since we've published this, we've given the CRMs an opportunity to systematically document these types of resources accurately so that the reviewing agencies like SHPO and the land managing agencies can concur with the recommendations. We also published Places to Remember in 2012 to commemorate Arizona's centennial. The cemetery focus on the cemeteries was a special project because many of these cemeteries are unmarked currently today. Many of them are in danger of being lost through urban development and also erosion and then vandalism. All of these are available online. If you go to the Arizona SHPO website, you just Google Arizona SHPO, look for their for the link for forums and publications, and you can find these if you're interested in downloading these. And finally, in recent years, actually for many years, the HAC has volunteered to do artifact work sessions, historical artifact work sessions at various conferences. And in 2022, we actually prepared webinars, online presentations of the various artifacts, and they are now online with the Arizona Preservation Foundation. If you're further interested in learning even more about historical ceramics, historical cans, bottles and jars, we compiled one for tools and hardware, and also for insulators and ammunition. All you have to do is Google Arizona Preservation Foundation YouTube channel, and you just go through it. They do, by the way, have plenty of other interesting webinars and presentations as well related to historic preservation in general. Hey, look at that. We all survived. And it only took a little over an hour.
Well, thank you, Tom. Now, there is one question. I mean, there are several questions. Bob asks, what's the chance of that 50-year threshold being changed?
That would take federal legislation at the federal level, and I can tell you, you can imagine how difficult that would be. I think the Arizona SHPO has attempted on certain resources like historical dumps to create a dialogue with the NPS and other agencies to maybe put a cap on historical garbage at 50 years and no longer, worrying about stuff from 1980 or 1990s when that ever comes up. But I don't think they have made any progress on that. It would be very difficult, Bob, to change that without some kind of federal legislation, and you can imagine the political nightmare that would ensue.
Okay, there's another question. Is there a specific collection strategy that is employed for historic dump features resources that acknowledges the challenges of curating large quantities of bulky materials?
The HAC, actually, I think it was the Governor's Archaeology Advisory Commission, which is GAC. I know these acronyms are pretty funny, aren't they? We did produce a report on that looming crisis. I believe it was 15 years ago. Might be 20 years now. But I think the best strategy for that would be in-field analysis, but we have to highlight that in our plans of work. If we're doing additional mitigation on a site, for instance, that's considered eligible, but there are quite a few historical, trash scatterers or artifacts across the surface, we'd be able to argue in our plan of work that in-field analysis would suffice. And in that manner, we would not have to collect or curate these large quantities. But I think that also would depend on ASM agreeing with that, as well as the Arizona SHPO. I'm not sure if anyone else online agrees with that or has anything else to say, Lauren or Jessica.
No, I
But
agree. It would take an act of Congress to amend the NHPA. And that might happen, but I think that it would require, bipartisan support. Um, and certainly then those regs would have to, in terms of federal law, right? So on the state, that's a different situation. The state may come in and on state land, as long as there's no federal undertaking, or private land, may have different rules, which is another place where the Arizona State Museum would be intricately involved. But yeah, I don't think that it's as easy to change. Um, it's not like it's written in as guidance. It is part of the actual law.
thank you very much.
And I have another question. Are construction and road crews good about calling in fines?
That's a mixed bag. Um, I've had some experiences where they are good about it, but then there are plenty when you find out after the fact that they are taking things that they find. So I think that's just a mixed bag.
Let
So
me
it's always best to have archaeologists on hand on the job site in these kinds of instances to ensure that that's not happening. But of course, that's not always the case.
I just wanted to quickly jump in before we got past the subject. Shannon Plummer also noted that I assume this is in respect to the 50-year rule that would also be an issue with the Arizona Antiquities Act.
Right.
Yep.
Well, are there any more questions?
I see a hand from Lauren.
If I could just say one more
Okay.
thing about this topic, I'm sorry, I don't want to be.
Oh.
I just wanted to say that just because a site is over 50 under the NHPA doesn't mean that it's eligible. So while we might still be required to record things that feel to us to be pretty recent, like I'm not gonna lie, seeing Barbie being recorded as a resource is going to be difficult. It still doesn't address whether or not it's significant, right? So the onus is really on the archaeologist to evaluate the integrity of the resource and what kind of information it has or its significance in general to make it eligible to qualify for protection. I hope that also helps a little bit. So just because it's a resource doesn't mean that it's a significant resource.
Great. Thank you. I think it's also important to keep in mind that I think a lot of the general public probably thinks that our industry holds up construction projects by what we do, but the vast majority of our cultural clearance that we do through this type of process, especially very early on, the vast majority of it, some 80%, is usually a negative findings kind of a thing where the construction process can continue on. As long as we're doing it correctly and efficiently and accurately, it's usually not a holdup for the project. In fact, we're the little people in the big bureaucratic process of constructing a road or the light rail, for instance. We are just the little people at the very bottom of the totem pole.
Okay, we've got a couple of comments. One, it seems that in historic preservation, we want to shorten the 50 years while archaeologists want to lengthen the time period. That's good for a whole another hour or so of discussion. And one of our attendees, Jared Smith, recommended your report with ACS on the Hayden Flour Mill history and archaeology.
He's just saying that because he owes me a beer and he's thinking I'll let him off.
Okay, all right, I understand that now. Okay, I know, Jared. Yeah, okay.
But as a comment for Andrea, the NHPA does have a criterion consideration for properties that are less than 50, so long as they are very important. So there is that kind of exception already built into the NHPA.
And we do have some significant properties, not necessarily in Arizona, but nationwide, that were accepted under that exception. Anyway, if there are
Well, thank you.
Hmm?
Oh, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say thank you again for all of you for attending, and thanks again to the Arizona Preservation Foundation and Donna and Margaret for hosting. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And thank you. We thank you. And remember,
You, Tom.
when the recording is ready, we will actually send out a notice to you that it has been posted. So in case you want to see it again or you missed something. So
And don't forget about the others that are also there on the APF website. Lots of great information for past presentations on various different material culture topics. So definitely hit those up.
Yes. Thank you very much. And we'll let you know the next time we have another webinar. Okay, so we